There were a couple of really big ahas that became part of what became a bigger picture than just the psychotherapy and the psychology of an individual person or myself. And that is that I realized that if I was so affected by what happened to me and it determined so many of the choices that I made in life and so many of the ways that I was not able to love myself or pursue, like dreams and feel like they were even possible for me, there must be millions of people like that.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hopeful Jaza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to Hopeful and Wholesome. Today I have on the show Phyllis Leavitt, and she has a master's degree in psychology and counseling and is a psychotherapist treating children, families, couples, and adults for over 30 years. She has worked extensively with abuse and dysfunctional family dynamics and their aftermath. And because of that, she is the author of 2 books, Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire, and actually a 3rd book that we're going to be talking about today, all about bringing America to therapy. And that really is our topic of conversation today. And we dive into so many topics, and Phyllis really has a lot of really incredible insight of this about this topic in this book, America and Therapy, in which she talks about the urgency to bring our whole country to therapy in a way that really we don't talk about. And it's a way that's never been written before, and what that means, and really how family dynamics are affecting mental health and affecting us as a collective. Such a really intriguing conversation. Let's jump in. All right, y'all, let's jump in. I'm here with Phyllis, and I'm excited for this insightful conversation that Phyllis is going to bring us today. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for joining me today, Phyllis.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here and talk with you.
Yeah. So I would love for you to kind of start out just talking a little bit about your background and just kind of how you got here, and that you have books and you speak and all of these things. And so can you just give us some background on who you are and how you got here?
Yeah, well, I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years now. So I'll back up to the beginning. Like so many people, I ended up being in a profession that actually was the profession that helped me. So as a child, I had some early childhood trauma that I buried, and I had no memory of it. And I just kind of grew up with a feeling of aloneness, and like there was a shadow over my life that I didn't know what it was. And so I interpreted that to mean that there was just something flawed about me, that I was different than other people in some way that I actually couldn't identify, but that left me feeling like I didn't fit anywhere. And my way of coping was I think I was probably born and more introverted. So my way of coping was to be more to myself. And I became like very interested in being a student. And I loved school. I loved learning. I loved reading. But I was kind of on the outside in terms of my social engagement growing up. And nothing looked particularly wrong. I probably looked just more like a more isolated kid.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there were any really big outward signs that all was not well. And then as I left home and went to college, that kind of depression and darkness got more intense. I think as I made my way into the world, I turned for a while to spiritual pursuits. Back in the 60s and 70s, that's what people were doing that were near me. And I joined a spiritual group, and it was good in many ways. It certainly spoke to my spiritual nature, which is definitely a part of me, and maybe part of what sort of saw me through. Was that sense of a spiritual connection, or the desire for one, I guess I would say, and a connection to nature that I started to experience later in life, which was very profound for me, but also sort of out of the norm. Back in the 60s and 70s, the connection to nature might have been what the hippie generation was talking about in terms of going back to the earth and farming, but in terms of like a real connection to self through nature, I don't remember anyone talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Long story short, I was in a marriage. I had 3 little children, and the marriage was sort of the culmination of what wasn't working in my life. I think a lot of people will relate to this, that because there was unhealed trauma that was sort of running the show of my psyche and my life, I wasn't attracted to someone who would be good for me. And so I was sort of moth to the flame, and that marriage kind of pushed me really to, I guess, to the point of where I in some ways didn't really want to live, but I also was not suicidal. I had 3 children that I adored, and too much of a connection of life. But it's sort of that space where you don't know how to proceed, and you can't go back, and you're just sort of stuck. And at that time, fortunately, many of the people that I knew were starting to go to psychotherapy. And so I gave it a shot. And that was a big turning point for me. I had never heard anyone say there's a connection between your conditioning and your upbringing and the influences and role models, particularly of your parents or your caregivers and the people most immediately in your circle of influence, and the way you come to believe about yourself, what you feel about yourself, the coping mechanisms you develop, and the role models you have for relationship are all very much conditioned by what we grow up with. And I had no idea about that until I read my first book about psychology, which I went to the library and got when I went to therapy for the first time. And then it was just sort of a slow unraveling after that. And I began to have some memories that were from so early in life that they came through, not like you remembered, having a blue trench coat in high school or that you lived on a certain street, but they came through more on an emotional, body, and somewhat visual level. Not until I was, I think I was about 40, maybe a little bit before that, but around the age of 40. And I was a long process for me in therapy of sort of unraveling the depth of what had occurred and the pain that was involved in that. But I became a psychotherapist. I went back to graduate school and I got my degree, and I decided that was the work I really wanted to do. So that's sort of the background of what evolved for me. And I think what happened for me, there were a couple of really big ahas that became part of what became a bigger picture than just the psychotherapy and the psychology of an individual person or myself. And that is that I realized that if I was so affected by what happened to me, and it determined so many of the choices that I made in life and so many of the ways that I was not able to love myself or pursue, like dreams and feel like they were even possible for me. If I was like that, there must be millions of people like that, and people who have suffered in ways that I haven't. Not to diminish what I experienced, but to say that there are people who, first of all, who don't have access to any kind of help, right, who don't have access to any kind of even psychological understanding, let alone help, who are in wars, who are victims of societal discrimination and crime and poverty and deprivation, who are traumatized. And I really got the scope and the depth of trauma. So I sort of got that from extrapolating from my own experience. And then as I was a therapist, it really struck me in ways that I never would have imagined how widespread and how deep the phenomenon of abuse and neglect is societally. Average people who get up and go to work and, perform the functions of life and raise their kids, many of whom are really suffering and just doing their best to look good on the outside and survive and make it, and not not even feeling the compassion for what they're up against that they deserve. And then I didn't feel compassion for myself. I just was critical of myself because like, what's wrong with you? Get it together, look good. Um, so I just began to make these associations between what's going on for the individual and the individual family and what's going on in our country, and in the larger institutions of our society, in a lot in the workplace, a lot in places of worship, even on the schoolyard, and other kinds of group formations where the same dynamics play out. And this is what I was seeing, that the same dynamics that are abusive and neglectful often play out in the larger institutions, affecting millions of people, thousands and millions of people who will blame themselves, as I did, who have not resource to help, which I did have, and who live lives of either quiet misery or end up inflicting their pain on the people around them, which is very hard not to do by neglect or overt, perpetration.
Sure.
So that's kind of where the idea for the book that I ended up writing, called America in Therapy, was born. And I know that these dynamics are playing out all over the world. But I focus on America because I live here and it's the country that I'm really familiar with.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of right now, that's the audience that I want to speak to, because I think we're facing some really big challenges here in terms of seeing some of these abuse dynamics playing out very powerfully on a national level, local and national level. But what I want to say, and what I really like to emphasize, is that one of the reasons why I wrote the book, there's a sort of a two-pronged book, and they go together. And it's exactly the same prongs that I was dealing with in my life. And that is, we need a diagnosis. We need to know what's wrong. When I began to remember what happened to me and understand something about the effects of abuse in childhood, the pieces of my life that seemed so scattered and difficult to understand all came together. And I wasn't a mystery to myself anymore. And I had a way to proceed. It wasn't easy, and I won't say that it wasn't painful at times, but there was hope. There was really hope. And it was important that I found people who held that hope for me, even when I didn't feel it myself. And that's one of the beautiful gifts of therapy, and other healing modalities. But the frame that I want to put around it is, and this is sort of the second prong. So we sort of need to know what happened to us, and we need to know the dynamics that are playing out that affect us so deeply, so many of us. And we need to know that there's hope for recovery. And one of the big points of my book and of my work is to say that many of the things that we know from the field of psychology and psychotherapy, and the best work especially in family systems theory about how to treat a family, could be applied to our country and our larger institutions for the sake of repairing our human relations and healing the harm that is happening now and that has been done in the past. I'm not saying it's the only answer. I'm not saying it's a perfect answer, because I don't think there actually is one perfect answer. But I think addressing our mental health on that level is one of the big missing pieces in America today.
Yeah.
So the second half of my book is really about how could we use the understandings and the tools of the best psychology and psychotherapy to help heal a nation. So, I want to put that frame around it, because some of what we're dealing with is really intense and really frightening and violent, and people are losing their lives and they're losing their homes. And it's not to diminish that and say, oh, there's like rah hope, but there is hope if we really could come together with a different lens on what is needed. That's my position. Yeah.
No, I love that.
Big intro.
Yeah, no, it was good. There's a lot to unpack there. So I would love to hear kind of your perspective on, because you're saying like bringing this mental health piece to light and kind of healing, the damage that's going on in our society and in our nation. And I do think you're right. I mean, regardless if you're talking about a national crisis or an international crisis, I do think that America is kind of at the forefront of this. I feel like we're behind in a lot of senses in terms of how we treat the body, in terms of and this is like, again, going down a rabbit hole, but like kind of separating the mind and the body, right? Where we're not treating all of it as a whole, right? And I feel like I do think there are obviously people like you. There's people that I've had on my podcast that are out there kind of changing the narrative, but it's going to take a lot of work to shift kind of our position on mental health and approaching it from that perspective where it's not a separate thing. Like, oh, you go to this doctor to do this, and you go to like that's I feel like that's kind of the big issue. So I would love to hear your thoughts on where you see kind of, I guess, where the breakdown is, like where the breakdown is happening in our country, that we have become so disconnected from our mental health, and it's not something that we're putting at the forefront. And then what do you see as the shift, I guess, that needs to happen there?
Well, one thing I would just want to say is there's no way that I could, tell you all the things that I
totally
think about that contribute to this. And I think there's other people that have other perspectives that are equally valid.
Yeah.
But to name some of the big ones that I think are responsible for where we are now, I think part of it is that we don't understand that that we don't understand family dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
We actually all are conditioned by our families. It's not like so we have a culture that's sort of blame and shame.
Mm-hmm.
That person's a bad guy. That person, she deserved what happened to her because she did blah, blah. So we have a very blame, right, wrong, good, bad mentality that is actually needing to be totally reworked because it's outdated, and it does not only does it not serve us, but it hurts us. So if we take, for example, and I think this is starting to change. I do think it's starting to change, but like you said, that understanding needs to become way more broad and then find its way into ways to implement different policies and practices in how we deal with one another. So if we take a school shooter, for instance, we are beginning to understand that most people that commit violent crimes like that are seriously disturbed. Mm-hmm. And they're seriously disturbed for a reason.
Right.
They didn't get born like with their wires crossed. And sometimes, people have birth abnormalities, but I'm not talking about that. Right. I'm talking about the general understanding that we're very beginning to have, that there's deprivation, that there's abuse, that there's a lack of belonging, there's bullying, and there's often overt abuse like physical violence and sexual abuse that have culminated in a person kind of losing it. Mm-hmm. And I think we are beginning to understand that. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that this is happening societally. The amount of sexual and physical violence toward children right now and spouses, I don't have a figure, but it's huge. Mm-hmm. And I think it's bigger than the data would suggest, just because there are so many people who don't report.
Right.
Them.
Mm-hmm.
And in my practice, over many, many years with people that are just like you and me, your average American person in some way, the level of violence and neglect and discrimination that people have suffered really is out of sight. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the turning points and this is the reason why I say America in therapy, right? Because I see it as if we could look at this as a national issue, if we could look at the family of America as not through the lens of blame, not through the lens of shame, but through the lens of what have we created societally that is producing this level of violence, that is producing this number of highly symptomatic people, a number of school shootings or mass shootings. In this year alone, I had a figure, but I don't have it in front of me. It's more than the number of days in the year. Yep. It's really horrifying. And we need to see this as a call for help for the family of America. And this is why I use this lens, because I think it's the one that really explains, maybe better than many other lenses, what we need to address. So in an individual family, often, and I don't know if you've heard this terminology, but you may have since you work with people, there's something called the identified patient. Is that a term you're familiar with?
Heard of that term. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's often the person who's the most symptomatic. Mm-hmm. So when I was working a lot with children and families, very often the child who was brought to therapy for bedwetting, for being aggressive toward their siblings, toward not doing well and we're not doing well in school, or having massive fears, or whatever the symptom was that had the parents bring them to therapy, most often their symptom was actually a symptom of family distress, a conflictual divorce, a death that had not been processed, parents who had addiction problems and were fighting all the time, that kind of thing. But they were the identified patient. They're the one who had the symptom that called the family to therapy.
Right.
And my contention is the most symptomatic among us are playing the same role for the society and the culture and the family of America. And they need to be looked at that way. Does that mean that we don't have to restrain people who are, actively out there wanting to murder others? Yeah, of course we do, because we have to be safe. We want to be safe.
Right.
But that's like the last line of defense. That may be necessary, and it may be necessary for some time to come in our society, that we don't know what else to do except restrain people that are the most dangerous. But some of the people that are the most dangerous are in positions of power. And I think we have to look at that. People whose impulses toward the general population, or segments of the population, which would probably be more accurate, their impulses are cruel. Their impulses are often inhumane. Impulses are often run by that same blame, shame, who's bad, and how are we going to get back at them mentality. And this is again, and you can interrupt me at any time, because my mind is a fast moving train.
I like it. Keep going.
We know in the field of psychology that there are things that help interrupt that cycle, and especially if there's early intervention.
And what are those things that help interrupt the cycle that you've seen?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about families. There are families that need help. So instead of just, and again, I'm not diminishing the need that some parents need to be taken away from their children.
Yeah.
Just already created so much harm and so much damage. But short of that, when there's violence in a family, let's just say physical violence, the family needs help. So if any restraint is needed, yes, but let's intervene. Let's have the agenda be, get those parents help. Their use of physical violence as a first resort, their children, is a symptom of their own unhealed wounds. They might have just learned that's the way you treat children in their family. They might have been very violently treated themselves, and their rage comes out at their children. I had a woman that I saw, one of my very first clients, was terribly physically abused by her dad, and all the children in her family were. I mean, they were basically just beaten. And she came to therapy because she had just had a baby, her first baby. And she was terrified when the baby cried that she would hit her. And she had the good sense to come to therapy and the opportunity. It's not just good sense, it's an opportunity. We know there are hundreds of thousands of people out there who have the same impulse based on the same conditioning, that don't have any help and don't know they need it, or whatever, who are acting that violence out on defenseless, innocent little children, not because they're bad people, but because their wounds are not treated. And so we have to see the victim inside the perpetrator as a beginning. And psychology is uniquely positioned to do that, because that's what we deal with. The healing for her, so that she did not hurt her baby, was to deal with the pain that had been buried inside of her from her own abuse, to find that innocent little girl who nobody stood up for, who didn't have any help, and work with all the tools of psychotherapy. And some of those are deep, early childhood, reparenting kind of models of therapy, whether it's hypnosis or guided visualization.
The inner child work.
The inner child work. So important, just so critically important, because we carry those wounds with us. And you know this, I know you know this really well. So that was the work with her.
Yeah.
And what if we got that as a nation?
Right.
That for the most part, the perpetration that's going on is a result of unhealed wounds.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to say this one thing, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, because it's an important one in this society where I think we suffer from, a lot of people are talking about this today, from malignant narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
People are so self-centered
Right.
and so stuck on what they need and what they want and their inflated view of themselves that they can't even digest what they're inflicting on other people.
Right.
They're so justified in what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
can't take in, don't have empathy and all those things. I want to describe I had two children like this that I worked with early on in my practice. Very loving parents. They were not being abused. They were not being beaten or sexually molested or, starved or, bullied. That was not what was happening in their homes. What was happening was their parents were too loving. They were too kind, and they didn't make any limits or boundaries around these children. One of them, they were both 3, I think, when I saw them, and these children were a mess. One of them was chasing their siblings around the house with the scissors.
Oh my gosh.
The other one had the whole family. She was in control of the entire family. She wouldn't go to bed. She wouldn't eat certain foods.
Oh my gosh.
And both of them had hideous tantrums.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't get what they wanted. They had tantrums. And what their parents were doing, bless their hearts, they didn't know better.
Yeah.
They were just giving in to
Right.
try to get the tantrums to subside.
Right.
So what you had were these 2 little children who were so inappropriately over-empowered that they were destructive. And had they grown up that way, and there are many children who do, they're entitled. They believe that their needs are the only important ones, and they're totally entitled to act their rage out on other people when they don't get what they want.
Yeah.
So it's another form of, I wouldn't call it, you could call it abuse, but I would call it through ignorance, severe emotional neglect.
Yeah, it's like the opposite end of the spectrum from the other. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Isn't it interesting that I find that fascinating? Like psychology in general, just always find it fascinating. I just find it fascinating that you have 2 opposite ends of the spectrum where these wounds can turn out like leading to like similar behavior down the road. Like it's crazy.
Right. It is, because it's interesting because, I mean, there's probably many becauses that I can't enumerate, but one of them is that both forms of early childhood conditioning produce in many people, not in all people, I have to go back and fill in a blank here, but in some people, a lack of empathy for others.
Right.
But there's really 2 basic outcomes. And I talk a lot about this in my book because I feel like it's really not a widely understood dynamic. There's 2 basic outcomes if you don't have the over-empowerment one. So we're putting that one to the side for a moment. If for people who grow up in abusive homes, and it can be sexual abuse, it can be physical abuse, it can be emotional abuse. And of course, with sexual and physical abuse, there is emotional abuse,
right.
Or severe neglect. And often they overlap, to separate them out. And they're on a continuum from, just a lot of really downgrading messages. Like you are not going to amount to anything. You're good, you're ugly, you're fat, you're stupid, kind of thing, to rape, or physical assault. So it's on a continuum, but the 2 main outcomes that I have seen over all the years that I've been in practice, when there's been no rescue, and even sometimes when there's been rescue later on, but no treatment, are either learned helplessness or identification with the aggressor. The 2 main outcomes are becoming passive, helpless, easily dominated and overpowered because you were dominated and overpowered and you really couldn't protect yourself. And so that got internalized. Okay. Or for some people, that is not the way their psyche goes. Their psyche goes toward, no one is ever going to do that to me again. And they become the aggressor.
Mm-hmm.
They become the angry,
Right.
defended, walled off person
Right.
who eventually will. And again, not everybody fits this mold to a T, but these are generalities that are more common than we like to perhaps think. Identify with aggressors on a national level, identify with aggressors in their communities, become either the bully on the playground or the kid who supports the bully on the playground, because they don't want to be bullied, right? And so left unchecked, learned helplessness and identification with the aggressor are very dangerous for us and for our society. If we are producing more and more people who tend to be easily dominated or tend to want to act out alongside the aggressor, we're in trouble, just like an individual family is in trouble.
Right.
So something has to interrupt that cycle. And and so my contention, again, I don't have all the answers, but I do think psychotherapy offers a lot that we could use. And the beginning is education.
Yeah.
We have to let people know what's happening to them. So I'm one voice. There's many voices talking about our mental health.
Yeah.
More people who speak up, the more people get this information and they can say, oh, this is what's happening to me. I'm going to get help. I'm going to go talk to somebody. I'm going to get out of that relationship. I'm going to do something different for my children. Or, oh, my kid is being really aggressive. Maybe he's hurting being a kid.
I think that's a big thing too. And I think going back to what you were saying about when you mentioned the inner child work, and I've had multiple episodes about that, and I talk about it all the time too, but I feel like that piece is huge. And I think it goes with the education informative piece that you're talking about, because I feel as in every time, and this sounds so terrible having to say this, but every time there's some mass shooting or school shooting, whatever, a friend of mine, I talk about this, my husband and I talk about this, I feel so devastated looking at both sides of it, right? And I think that's what you're saying too, understanding the mindset of the aggressor, right? And understanding hurt people, right? We hear that all the time, but understanding how he or she got into this mindset that's what he or she had to do, right? And it just, for me, it kills me, because it's obviously it's it's a tragedy for the people that are the victims, but then it's okay, well, then you have this person and they're no longer treated as a human when we're talking about them, and not to diminish the violence that they've inflicted, but understanding that there was something that happened in this person's life that led them to this point. And I feel like the inner child work, and I talked to those with a gal I interviewed a while back, but what would happen to our nation if everybody went the psychotherapy, all this you're talking about is it though, understanding the inner child work and understanding where those wounds come from. And for you talking about the informative, the educational, the informative piece, understanding there's reasons that people act out. There's reasons people do the things they do. It's not because it's not you're just a bad person, right? There's a reason. And I think so often, and especially just a lot with the powers that be in this country, it's we just brush it off as, oh, it's a terrible thing. It's a bad person, or it's a violent person, or they're a criminal or whatever. But it's the same thing when you think about prisons. You send people in prison. Well, how is that helping them out? Why are we not working to rehabilitate these people and get to the bottom of why they committed the crime in the first place?
That's right.
It's just, I think there's such a huge gap. And I think we do lose that sense of, not necessarily empathy. I don't want to empathize with them, but the sense of just understanding, right? Understanding how or why they got to this point, that this was what they had to do, was commit this crime or this violent act or whatever.
100%. And I think empathy, it's not wrong to have empathy. That doesn't mean you don't take right action.
Right.
But yeah, and one of the things when I was doing some of the research for my book, I had come across some very alarming and powerful statistics about the number of people who are incarcerated now who had untreated child abuse, severe child abuse.
Totally.
So it's how do we stop this train? We can't go on just blaming people. And yes, of course, we have to hold people responsible.
Right.
It's that balance. It's like what you're saying. How do you find the balance between your heart breaks for the parents of the children who died and your heart breaks for the childhood of the person who killed them? And that's why I think we need this family therapy lens on America, because many of the influences on people today are not just coming from their family of origin. They're coming from the family of America.
Right.
They're coming from the role models of who's acceptable that they see on the media. They're coming from the role models of how people deal with conflict. They're all over the media. So it's like we have a collective responsibility, not blame, responsibility.
Right.
And that's why for me, I feel like the more people that speak out, the better.
Yeah.
One of the characteristics, and I go into a lot of detail in my book about what are the most important dynamics of an abusive family and abusers, so that people really get a sense of how they correlate to what goes on. Not in all places in America, of course, but in too many, perhaps, places in America. But one of the things that it goes back to the idea of learned helplessness. Abusers overpower their victims. They can't hurt them unless they can overpower them.
Right.
Whether it's with threats or physical force or shame and blame, or there's some way, withholding the necessities of life. There's some way that an abuser has power over the people that they hurt. And so many people in our society today feel like there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do, about the corruption in government or the policies that are discriminatory. And because they're having that same effect. And that's actually what an abuser wants. An abuser wants you to feel powerless.
Right.
You won't resist, so they can continue to do whatever it is they're doing. And I think that's one of the big things to call out. We do have power. You have power as a podcaster, and you're using it for the collective good. You can bring in voices of intelligence and healing and compassion and deep understanding and a wide variety of perspectives. You can bring them to the table just by having a podcast and the expertise that you bring to it from your training and your experience and the people you work with. And so, one of the things that's so important is that we all have power somewhere. And we need to know that and find that, even if our power today is we can be kinder to our neighbor, be a little softer with our children. We can be more understanding with our spouse. We can be more compassionate to our coworker who's having a rough time. We all have power to make change. And that's of course the tip of a big iceberg. But I just want to say that because I've shared this a lot in some of the podcasts that I've been on. I've been a psychotherapist since 1989. I think I saw my first clients. And in all the years that I have been a therapist, it wasn't until the year prior to the 2016 election that I ever had a client come to therapy and talk about how traumatized they felt by what was going on in our country. I've never had that. People just talk about their own lives, their own struggles, their marriages, their kids, whatever. And all of a sudden, people were coming in sleepless and afraid we were going to become another Nazi Germany and terrified about the election results. And so I could even see that in my office. And I think and then what I hear now from a lot of people, in sort of casual conversation here and there is there's nothing we can do. The race is probably doomed.
Yep.
Well, I don't accept that.
Yeah. I agree. And I feel like that's a big piece too of it, because I agree with you. And I hear, conversations we have with family and friends and stuff too, the same thing. And we see, now, granted, social media makes it, I don't know. I never can figure out if it's which I know it's more prominent, like the school shootings and the mass shootings. Obviously, we know that's more prominent. But sometimes with the violence and things, I'm like, okay, is this, more frequent than it used to be, or are we just seeing it more because of social media? But either way, it's prevalent. And I feel like that's the feelings of a lot of people is it's well, what can we do? It's on a national level. We're seeing this play out in front of our eyes on a national level. it's like, what can we do to fix it? What can you do to stop it? I think people do feel helpless to do anything about it and to change the course of, where we're heading, or change the narrative, or change the conversation. People do feel helpless with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things and I think they do, because I think it feels like I don't know what to do about that family over there.
Right.
And I don't want them near me if they're violent,
Right.
our natural self-protection.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to influence the larger structures
Right.
and policymakers in our country. And what does my vote really count for anyway?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Go down that hole.
Yep.
But I think that that's why I think education is so important,
Yep.
because there are so many things like what we just talked about that a person can do, but also we can start to talk about changing policy. One of the things that I became so aware of when I started to really think deeply about what I wanted to say about this whole subject was um, human beings are incredibly talented, incredibly creative, incredibly gifted, and incredibly capable of having massively huge hearts and generous behaviors toward and compassionate behaviors toward other people. And the number of people in our country who are like that is actually huge.
Mm-hmm.
We have a population of I did some research on this too, of like, and again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there's billions of dollars given to charity in our country. There are millions of people who volunteer their time for no money, no reward, to help others in need.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that that strength is under there. That is part of who we are as well.
Yeah.
In contrast to some of the more disturbed behaviors that come out of abuse and neglect.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was thinking to myself was, we have resources. We put so many dollars, so many man hours, so much of our thought into weapons,
Mm-hmm.
Weapons of mass destruction and other weapons that we could allocate to families, to helping children get out of poverty, to providing treatment and family resources, retraining, parent education, community building, so people feel like they're a part of. We know what people need.
Access to therapy. Yeah.
And building a community around people that actually supports them to be constructive, work out their problems without conflict. And I don't mean to sound like a Pollyanna, because I don't think it is Pollyanna thinking. Will it happen tomorrow? Probably no. But if we could redirect our man hours, our attention, our expertise, and our will, as well as our dollars, toward helping the American family survive and thrive, we will have a different country. And we do know so much of how to do that.
So
people need to feel like they belong. They need to feel like they're valued. They need to learn nonviolent conflict resolution skills, and have someone support them to do that, not shame them for not doing it. Right?
Yep.
We could role model that in Congress.
Yeah.
We could role model deep listening skills in Congress. That's one of my dreams. And what a role model would that be for our young people?
Yep. Yeah. I love that. I love this conversation with you, Phyllis. We could talk about this for hours. As we start to wrap up here, can you let everybody know, before I ask you our last question, can you let everybody know where they can find out more about you, your book that we've been talking about, and just continuing this conversation and this activism that you're leading forward?
Yeah, please look for me on my website, first and foremost, www.phyllisleavitt.com, because that's where all the news will be about when my book is out. It's not out yet. So it's in the process. So you can be the first to know when it's available, but also I'm on Facebook, and I post a lot on LinkedIn and Instagram, a little bit on Twitter. Maybe I'll get to TikTok.
One of these days. I'm with you there.
But if you go to my website, you can also enter your email address, and then you'll be on my mailing list, and I'll let you know best updates.
Perfect. So y'all, I have the links to all that in the show notes, of course. Y'all can go sign up. Make sure you get the word when Phyllis's book is out. I'm excited for you. This is such a good conversation to bring forward. Thank you for this. So the last question that I want to ask you, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
I think we all have a purpose. I think we all have a contribution that is worthwhile, no matter what we think of how big or small it might be. For somebody, it might be they want to, clean the water on the whole earth. And for another person, it might be that they love animals and they want to, have dogs, or they love nature and they want to have a garden. And there really is I don't think there's one is more valuable or less valuable than the other. I think living with purpose is really following your own heart, following your own intuition of what draws you in life, what makes you happy, what fulfills you. And it doesn't have to be anything big and splashy. It really doesn't. So I think it's really getting in tune with what your greatest gifts and what your heart calls you to, that it ends up being our best contribution anyway.
That's so true. I love that. 100%. I so agree with you. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for this conversation and for leading the way in the nation with this conversation with your book and the conversations you're having on podcasts like this. I'm thankful for your time. Thank you.
I'm thankful for yours. Thank you so much. It's just been wonderful talking with you.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I'd love to know what you find useful in these episodes so I can know how to provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics you'd like to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or you can visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.